The scav's name was Voss, and the first thing he taught her was how to be still, not quiet. Quiet was easy. Quiet was just the absence of sound. Still was different. Still was letting the world move around you without letting it find you. Still was a discipline, a practiced emptiness, the kind of thing you had to want badly enough to hurt for. He'd learned it in a different life, one he didn't talk about, and he'd held on to it the way a man holds onto a single match in a wet darkness. He found her in the ruins of what the Veth had left of Sector 12. She was crouched behind a fallen girder, knees up, arms wrapped around them, watching him with eyes that held too much experience for a face that small. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Though with the way the world had gone these last 4 years, it was hard to tell age from the evidence of survival alone. She had hair the color of dead grass, and a smear of something dark across her cheekbone that had dried there days ago. She didn't run when she saw him. She didn't speak. She just watched. Voss crouched down to her level, slow and deliberate, and set his pack on the ground between them. He opened the top flap without looking away from her. He pulled out a dented tin of compressed protein gel, the kind that tasted like a boot but kept the muscles from eating themselves, and he held it out. She looked at the tin. She looked at him. She took it. That was the beginning. He called her Marigold for the first 3 days until Shishi corrected him. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, hard enough to leave a red mark, and she said the word like she was the only one in the world who'd ever owned it. Daffodil. Not a question. Not an introduction. A fact, presented without ceremony. He said it back to her, and she nodded once and went back to eating. He didn't know where she'd come from, and he didn't ask. There was a code among the living in the Veth occupation zones. You didn't excavate the time before. That way lay a grief so total it could stop a heart outright. You asked about now. Where are you camped? What have you seen? Is the Eastern Corridor still open? The past was a country that had been bombed flat, and everyone's dead lived there, and you didn't go back. What he did know was that she was feral in the specific ways that mattered, and soft in the specific ways that would get her killed. She knew how to find water. She knew how to move through rubble, without dislodging anything that would make sound. She'd clearly eaten enough to have survived, which meant she had some instinct for what was and wasn't a reasonable risk. But she didn't know the Veth. Not really. She knew enough to be afraid of them, which was something. The children who didn't fear the Veth were usually the ones who'd been taken to the processing centers. But she didn't understand how they tracked, how they communicated, how they decided what was worth their attention and what wasn't. Voss understood all of that. He'd made it his business to understand it. The Veth had come down 4 years ago, though come down wasn't quite right. They hadn't descended dramatically out of the sky, with their ships lined up in the kind of geometric formation that made for good photos. They'd arrived the way a flood arrives. First the signs you didn't read correctly, then the rising water, then the understanding that it was too late to be anywhere but high ground. By the time anyone truly understood what was happening, the capital cities were gone, communications were gone, the power grid was a memory, and the Veth were simply there. Present, implacable, going about their business with the unhurried certainty of something that had never been seriously doubted before, and had no expectation of being doubted now. What they wanted was the matter of significant disagreement among the surviving humans. The scavengers and the settlement communities had their theories. The Veth were mining something from the crust. The Veth were terraforming the atmosphere. The Veth were conducting some kind of biological survey. The Veth simply didn't care that humanity existed on the same rock, and were proceeding with their agenda, with the mild inconvenience of people working around ants at a construction site. Voss had a different theory, one he'd arrived at slowly and hadn't shared with anyone, because it was the kind of theory that sounded insane until you couldn't stop believing it. He thought the Veth were afraid of them, not afraid in any human sense. No cortisol spike, no adrenaline, no dry mouth before a confrontation, but something analogous to it. Something that looked, from the outside, like the way a careful person handles an object they've been told is unstable. The Veth were meticulous in a way that didn't match the behavior of a species dealing with a nuisance. They documented everything. They catalogued everything. They moved through human settlements and took measurements and collected samples, with the focused attention of something that needed to understand what it was dealing with. You didn't document something you intended to simply erase. You documented something that surprised you, something you hadn't expected. He began to teach Daffodil in the hours between dusk and full dark, because those were the hours when the Veth reduced their ground patrols. Another thing he'd catalogued. They didn't like the transition light. Something in their photoreception, he guessed. They had 3 compound visual organs on each side of their angular skulls, sensitive to spectrums humans couldn't perceive. But the wavelengths that fired during dusk seemed to produce something analogous to interference. They moved slower. They were, for those 30 to 40 minutes between last light and true dark, a little less than they normally were. He taught her what the Veth left behind them. The traces, the residue, the absence of things they'd processed. He taught her the sound of a sentry drone before it rounded a corner, the low subsonic pulse that you felt in the molars half a second before the machine appeared. He taught her that the Veth communicated through a combination of bioluminescent signal and subsonic pulse that translated, in rough human terms, to something like a hierarchical broadcast. The highest caste signal carried command, and the lower caste signals confirmed reception, and the whole thing ran on a logic tree that was rigid and rule-bound in ways that human radio communication had never been. That rigidity was their weakness. He'd known it for a year, he just never had a reason to use it. He started by drawing in the dirt with a stick simple diagrams. She crouched beside him and watched his hands and then picked up her own stick and copied what he drew, exactly on the first try. He was so startled he stopped and just looked at her. She looked back at him with those flat, serious eyes. "Do that again," he said. He drew a new pattern, a rough map of the broadcast intervals he'd catalogued, the timing sequences he'd measured against an old watch that still ran on its mechanical spring. She reproduced it. Not approximately, precisely, down to proportions he hadn't consciously noted but that she'd somehow absorbed at a glance. He sat back on his heels and thought about that. The Veth had swept through and taken the strategists, the military commanders, the engineers, the scientists, the obvious assets. They'd left the children, largely, because children didn't register on whatever metric they used to assess threat. He thought that was probably the most significant mistake they'd made. Children learned, children observed. Children sat very still and took in everything around them and stored it in the deep memory that adults slowly lost access to, and they had not yet developed the adults' capacity for assuming they understood something before they truly did. He told Daffodil, "You understand what you see better than I do." She considered this. She said, "Then show me more." So he showed her more. Over the weeks that followed, they moved through Sector 12 and into the adjacent rubble of what had been an industrial district. Following the routes Voss had mapped and adding to the map as they went. He taught her to read the Veth's residue signs the way a tracker reads animal spoor, the thermal burn patterns that marked where a processing unit had operated, the crystalline deposits the sentry drones shed at their turning points, the subtle subsidence in soil where the Veth had run their root cables. She learned all of it with the same eerie precision, and she began to annotate what she saw in ways that surprised him. Noticing patterns in the turning points, regularities in the burn deposits that suggested a scheduling logic he hadn't identified. "They come back," she said one evening, pointing to a sequence of marks she'd scratched into the base of a ruined wall. Same intervals, like a heartbeat. He studied what she'd drawn and felt something cold and clarifying move through his chest. She was right. He'd been tracking the where of the Veth patrols, not the when in their full recursive structure. She had identified a resonance he'd missed. Their command signal, she said. It's what tells them when to come back. If the command signal changed, they'd be confused, he said. Not confused, she said, with the precise literalness of a child who meant what she said. Wrong. They'd be wrong about where they were supposed to be. There was a human settlement 2 sectors north, 40, maybe 50 people in an old water treatment facility with thick concrete walls and multiple exits. Voss knew the route to it. He'd always moved alone, come in for supplies, come out again. The community's leader, a former civil engineer named Crest, had offered him a place there twice. He'd declined twice. He didn't trust concentrations of people. They drew attention. They drew each other into the kind of emotional geometry that made people do stupid things. He trusted Daffodil. He wasn't sure when that had happened, but it had, and the fact of it had changed his calculations. He took her to the settlement. Crest was a broadman patient, in the way of someone who'd chosen patience as a survival strategy rather than been born to it. He watched Daffodil with an expression that was half assessment and half something softer, and he asked no questions about where she'd come from. He set her up in one of the side rooms with a folded blanket and a clean tin cup, and she accepted both without speaking. And that night Voss heard her moving around in the room after the lights were down. Quiet but not still. The restless circuit of a small creature in an unfamiliar space. He told Crest what Daffodil had found. Crest was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're telling me a child worked out the Veth patrol schedule." "She worked out the structure underneath the schedule," Voss said. "That's different. The schedule I already had. She found the logic driving it." Crest looked at him steadily. "And you think we can use that?" "I think we have to." He pulled the map out, worn paper now covered in pencil marks, and Daffodil's scratchitations in the margins, small precise marks that ran along the edges with the regular spacing of a scientific notation. The Veth command signal runs on a 40-minute broadcast cycle. If you interrupt or replicate that signal at the wrong phase, you introduce what amounts to a false confirmation. The lower caste units receive what they interpret as a command relay and hold position waiting for the next instruction. It doesn't shut them down, but it stops them cold for however long it takes the command hierarchy to identify the anomaly and recalibrate. How long is that? She thinks between 12 and 15 minutes based on the intervals she's tracked. Crest looked at the notations along the margin of the map. "She thinks," he said. "Not skeptical, just precise. Her word count on things she's certain about is lower than mine," Voss said. "I've noticed it's a reliable indicator. What they built wasn't elegant." Voss had spent 4 years being pragmatic about elegance. It was a signal replicator assembled from scavenged components. A radio oscillator from a vehicle the Veth had left stripped but not fully processed. A directional antenna improvised from copper pipe and mesh. Timing circuitry that ran off a spring-wound mechanism because they couldn't trust battery reliability, and absolutely could not use anything that drew power from what remained of the grid, since the Veth monitored that. It took 9 days. Crest's people contributed components, and Crest himself contributed a knowledge of electrical fundamentals that Voss lacked. Daffodil sat in the corner of the workshop and watched and occasionally pointed at something, and looked at Voss and waited for him to understand what she was pointing at. Every time he understood, she went back to being still. On the 10th day, they ran the sequence. Voss positioned the device at a point he and Daffodil had identified as the apex of the patrol circuit, the location from which the broadcast would hit the maximum number of lower caste units in their current positions. Daffodil was with Crest back at the settlement, because Voss had made that condition non-negotiable, and she had accepted it without argument, which was the thing about her that still, after all these weeks, caught him off guard. She argued about things she thought were wrong. She went silent about things she'd decided to accept. The distinction was clear to her, if not always to him. He triggered the replicator at the 40-minute mark. The subsonic pulse that came out of it was imperfect. He could tell by how it felt in his jaw, but close enough. Close enough was what he'd been hoping for. The 2 sentry drones in his line of sight stopped. Just stopped, mid-traverse, as though someone had paused a recording. Their navigation lights shifted from the moving amber of active patrol to the stationary blue of a receive state. Waiting for the next instruction that was not coming. He had 12 minutes, maybe 15. He started moving. What came next was not a battle. He wanted to be clear about that, in the account he later gave. Because battles implied things about force and opposition that weren't accurate. What came next was 47 people moving through a 12-minute window, in a sector that the Veth currently believed was under their complete observation, while that observation was suspended. They moved fast and they moved quiet, and they moved in the routes Daffodil had mapped. The ones that threaded between the turning points, that used the angles of the ruins as visual barriers, that crossed the open ground at the specific locations where the sentry drone tent coverage had gaps that she had identified with her maddening, precise child's attention to pattern. Not a single one of them was taken. They made it to the secondary structure Crest had been working toward for 3 months. Deeper in the ruins, structurally stable, defensible, and far enough from the Veth's current processing zone that they'd have time to settle before the patrol logic recalibrated and began its expansion survey. 47 people, 12 minutes, no casualties. Voss arrived last, because that was also non-negotiable, and Daffodil was waiting at the entrance with her arms at her sides and her face doing nothing visible, and her eyes doing everything. He said, "It worked." She said, "I know. You couldn't have known. You weren't there." She looked at him with the patience of someone explaining something to a well-meaning adult. "I knew before you left," she said. He didn't argue with her. In the weeks following the move, when the settlement was beginning to become something, when the routines were establishing themselves, when the youngest kids were starting to learn from the older ones, and the older ones were starting to teach the way people teach, when they've decided there's a future to teach toward. Voss found himself doing something he hadn't done in 4 years. He was sitting still without being watchful, just sitting. Outside the entrance in the early morning before the light shifted, hands around a cup of hot water that was the closest thing they had to coffee, and not cataloging anything, Daffodil came and sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder touched his arm, and she looked out at the same ruined landscape he was looking at, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The Veth don't understand why we keep going." He thought about it. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they're starting to." "If they are," she said, "that's when we have to be careful." He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon, where the sky was doing that thing it did in the last minutes before sunrise, the particular gradient that he had forgotten to notice for years, and that he'd started noticing again recently, and he was aware of the specific way the light was catching the color of her hair, which was the color dead grass went when it was beginning slightly to come back. He said, "You've been thinking about the next one." She said, "Haven't you?" He had. Of course he had. The signal replication had worked once. It would work again, maybe twice more before the Veth identified and compensated for the anomaly in their broadcast cycle. They had a window, not a solution. A window was enough to start with. A window was more than humanity had had 4 years ago when the Veth arrived and the world went from certain to impossible in the span of weeks. Daffodil picked up a piece of broken concrete from the ground beside her and turned it in her hands. She scratched a mark into it with her thumbnail and then scratched another mark and then held it out to him. He looked at what she'd drawn. It was a map, a new one. Something she'd been composing in her head while they sat. The marks ran along the edge of the concrete fragment the same way they ran along the edges of the paper maps. Precise, regular, annotated in a system that was halfway between notation and language, and that he was only beginning to understand. He took it from her. He studied it. "This is the relay point," he said. "East of the processing zone. Yes, if you interrupt the signal there, the whole eastern grid drops. Not 12 minutes. She looked at him steadily. Longer. He sat with that. He turned the concrete fragment in his hands and looked at the marks she'd made, and thought about what 47 people had managed in 12 minutes, and what a community of people who now believed in what was possible might manage in something longer. He said, "How many people do you think we'd need?" She looked at the horizon. She said the number without hesitation, the way she said everything she was certain about. It was not a small number. It was, in fact, the kind of number that implied a network, implied coordination across sectors, implied a degree of organization that humanity had not managed since the Veth arrived and shattered the structures that organization used to run through. It was the kind of number that implied something like hope organized into something like strategy. He said, "We'd need to reach the other settlements." "Yes," she said. "That's going to take time." "Yes," she said. He finished his hot water. He set the cup down. He looked at the map she'd made and then at her, and then back at the horizon, where the light was doing what light does when it's decided it's going to come back, regardless of whether you're ready for it. He stood up. "All right," he said, "show me." She stood up beside him. She was still small, still thin, still carrying in her face the specific weight of a child who had survived things that children should not have to survive. But she was also something else, something he had no good word for. Something that had been there when he found her in the rubble and that he had watched grow clearer and more defined over the weeks they'd spent moving through ruins and cataloging enemy patterns and building signal devices out of salvage. She was the kind of thing the Veth, with all their careful documentation and all their precise survey methodology, had not thought to measure. The kind of thing that didn't register on their instruments. The kind of thing that looked, from a certain angle, like a child sitting quietly in the ruins of a broken world. And that was, from another angle, exactly the thing that was going to take it back. She walked forward. He walked beside her. The light came up full and hard over the ruins, and they went to work. The scav's name was Voss, and the first thing he taught her was how to be still, not quiet. Quiet was easy. Quiet was just the absence of sound. Still was different. Still was letting the world move around you without letting it find you. Still was a discipline, a practiced emptiness, the kind of thing you had to want badly enough to hurt for. He'd learned it in a different life, one he didn't talk about, and he'd held on to it the way a man holds onto a single match in a wet darkness. He found her in the ruins of what the Veth had left of Sector 12. She was crouched behind a fallen girder, knees up, arms wrapped around them, watching him with eyes that held too much experience for a face that small. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Though with the way the world had gone these last 4 years, it was hard to tell age from the evidence of survival alone. She had hair the color of dead grass, and a smear of something dark across her cheekbone that had dried there days ago. She didn't run when she saw him. She didn't speak. She just watched. Voss crouched down to her level, slow and deliberate, and set his pack on the ground between them. He opened the top flap without looking away from her. He pulled out a dented tin of compressed protein gel, the kind that tasted like a boot but kept the muscles from eating themselves, and he held it out. She looked at the tin. She looked at him. She took it. That was the beginning. He called her Marigold for the first 3 days until she corrected him. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, hard enough to leave a red mark, and she said the word like she was the only one in the world who'd ever owned it. Daffodil. Not a question. Not an introduction. A fact, presented without ceremony. He said it back to her, and she nodded once and went back to eating. He didn't know where she'd come from, and he didn't ask. There was a code among the living in the Veth occupation zones. You didn't excavate the time before. That way lay a grief so total it could stop a heart outright. You asked about now.